The sun hung low over the ruined city, casting long shadows over streets littered with abandoned cars, broken glass, and corpses that refused to stay dead. The walls of the Refuge, a repurposed military outpost, stood tall against the desolation, lined with makeshift barricades and watchtowers manned by the last remnants of humanity. Inside, Ethan Graves, a former Marine turned reluctant leader, paced along the northern wall. He gripped his rifle, scanning the horizon. The past few weeks had been quiet, too quiet. The dead weren't mindless wanderers anymore. They were moving with purpose, gathering in numbers too vast to comprehend. A shout from Reyes, one of the lookouts, shattered the uneasy silence. "Commander! We've got movement, northwest perimeter." Ethan was at the watchtower in seconds, his heart hammering. Through a pair of old binoculars, he spotted them. A horde, larger than any he had seen before, spilling over the hills in waves. Thousands of them. Their rotting bodies shambled forward, some faster than others. The smart ones, the ones that learned. "Sound the alarm," Ethan ordered, his voice calm despite the dread clawing at his chest. The Refuge roared to life. Sirens blared. Fighters scrambled to their stations, hastily loading weapons. Civilians rushed to the underground bunkers, mothers clutching their children, knowing that this might be the night everything ended. Down by the gate, Tara Wells, a sharpshooter and one of the few people Ethan fully trusted, adjusted her scope. "This isn't just another attack," she murmured. "They're testing us." Ethan nodded. "And if we fail the test, we die." Within minutes, the first wave of undead reached the outer defenses. Gunfire erupted, cutting down the front line. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the sickly stench of rotting flesh. But for every zombie that fell, 3 more took its place. "Focus on the crawlers and the sprinters first," Ethan barked, firing into the oncoming mass. The smarter ones had learned to hide among the slow ones, breaking into a full sprint once they were close enough to overwhelm the defenders. The Refuge had held against attacks before, but never against something like this. Ethan's gut twisted. This wasn't a random migration of the dead. This was a siege. A deafening boom shook the compound as a section of the outer barricade gave way. Something had hit it, hard. Not a mindless corpse. Something worse. "Reyes, report." Ethan shouted into his radio. Static. Then, something big, "Oh, hell, it's breaching." Then silence. Ethan swore under his breath. If the Horde broke through, the Refuge was done for. He grabbed Tara's shoulder. "We need to hold them at the breach. Now." Together, they rushed down, pushing through the chaos of retreating fighters. The barricade was splintered, as if something had smashed through it with brute force. And then Ethan saw it. A Titan. 8 feet tall, grotesquely mutated, its flesh fused with bone in unnatural ways. It stood at the opening, its empty, milky white eyes locking onto Ethan. And then it charged. Ethan barely had time to react before the world became a blur of pain and dust. Ethan hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as he rolled to avoid the Titan's crushing foot. The earth trembled under the creature's weight, its mutated form towering over him like a nightmare made flesh. Around them, the dead surged through the broken barricade, pouring into the Refuge like a living tide of rot and hunger. Gunfire erupted from the perimeter as defenders tried desperately to hold the line. Tara fired off a shot, the high-caliber round slamming into the Titan's shoulder. The beast barely flinched. It turned its grotesque head toward her, its gaping mouth stretching wider than should have been possible. "Ethan, move," she yelled. Adrenaline surged through him, forcing him to his feet. The Titan roared and charged, its massive arms swinging wildly. Ethan barely dodged in time, feeling the rush of air as its fist smashed into the ground where he'd been standing. "Bring it down. Aim for the joints," he shouted. Tara adjusted her aim and fired again. This time, her bullet shattered the Titan's knee. It staggered, letting out a guttural, inhuman scream, but it wasn't down yet. Ethan didn't wait. He sprinted toward the nearest supply crate, yanking out a grenade. "Cover me." Tara and the remaining defenders unleashed a hail of bullets as Ethan closed the distance. He pulled the pin and shoved the grenade deep into the Titan's torn-open knee wound before diving away. The explosion sent bits of rotting flesh and bone flying, and the Titan collapsed, its monstrous form twitching before finally going still. But there was no time to celebrate. "The breach is open." Reyes' panicked voice crackled through the radio. "We can't hold them back." Ethan gritted his teeth. The dead were inside the refuge now. If they didn't stop them here, everyone, fighters, civilians, the last remnants of humanity, would be slaughtered. "We fall back to the second line of defense," he ordered. The survivors sprinted toward the inner barricades, retreating through the narrow kill zones they had prepared for an attack like this. As they ran, Ethan saw families being rushed into the underground bunkers, their terrified eyes watching as their last line of defense crumbled. "Close the gates. Funnel them in." Massive iron barriers groaned as they were pulled shut, forcing the Horde into the corridor of death, a tight passage where the defenders could unleash everything they had. From the rooftops, flamethrowers ignited, bathing the first wave in searing fire. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. But they kept coming. Ethan reloaded his rifle, sweat dripping down his face. He knew this was only buying them time. They were trapped, and the Horde wasn't stopping. A scream cut through the chaos. "Reyes!" Ethan turned just in time to see his friend dragged over the barricade, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he disappeared into the swarm. His screams didn't last long. "Damn it!" Tara hissed. "We're losing too many." Ethan's mind raced. They needed a way out, a plan. That's when he remembered the fuel depot near the southern wall. "Tara, we can't win this fight. We need to clear a path and get the survivors out." She gave him a sharp look. "You're talking about blowing the depot? It's our only chance." Tara hesitated, then nodded. "Then we better move fast." Ethan grabbed his radio. "All units, fall back toward the fuel depot. We're blowing the south wall and making a run for it." There was no time to argue. The last fighters abandoned their positions, laying down covering fire as they sprinted toward the depot. Behind them, the Horde surged forward, an unstoppable force of death. The walls of the refuge wouldn't hold. Not this time. Their last refuge was about to fall. Ethan ran with everything he had, his boots pounding against the blood-soaked dirt. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder as the last of the defenders abandoned their positions, retreating toward the fuel depot near the southern wall. The dead swarmed behind them, their guttural moans blending with the crackle of flames. The refuge was lost, its defenses overrun, its walls crumbling under the weight of the endless Horde. Tara sprinted beside him, reloading her rifle as she shouted over the chaos. "How much fuel is left in the tanks?" Ethan didn't know for sure, but it had to be enough. The depot had been stocked with diesel and aviation fuel, meant for generators and emergency vehicles that hadn't run in months. It wasn't just an explosion they were triggering, it was a firestorm. A group of survivors, what was left of the fighters, were already at the depot, dragging makeshift explosives toward the largest fuel tanks. Harris, a former demolitions expert, was wiring the last set of charges when he spotted Ethan. "You sure about this?" Harris asked, his face slick with sweat. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Light it up." The last gate between them and the Horde wouldn't last much longer. The metal buckled and groaned under the weight of countless bodies pushing against it. Hands clawed through the gaps, fingers missing flesh, eager to tear into anything alive. Tara handed Ethan the detonator, her expression grim. "We won't get another chance." Ethan looked at the crowd of survivors, fighters, civilians, children. This wasn't just about escaping. It was about buying them a future. "Everyone, move," he shouted. The group rushed toward the service tunnel beneath the south wall, a narrow maintenance shaft that led beyond the refuge's perimeter. It was their only way out before the fire consumed everything. The gate collapsed. The horde flooded in like a living avalanche. Hundreds in the first wave, thousands more behind them. Ethan didn't wait. He pressed the detonator. A thunderous explosion ripped through the depot, and then came the fire, roaring, consuming, unstoppable. The force of the blast knocked Ethan off his feet. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, the sky turning orange and black as a massive fireball swallowed the southern half of the refuge. The heat was unbearable, the flames spreading too fast, feeding on fuel-soaked soil and ruined buildings. The dead didn't scream, they never did, but they burned, their decayed bodies melting, twisting, collapsing under the inferno. The blast ripped through the horde, incinerating thousands in seconds. But Ethan knew it wouldn't kill them all. The explosion wasn't just about taking out the dead, it was about creating a distraction. Tara grabbed his arm, pulling him up. "Come on. We have to go." Smoke burned his lungs as he stumbled toward the tunnel. The last survivors were already inside, crawling, running, dragging the wounded through the narrow passageway. Harris was the last one in, shoving debris behind him to block the entrance. "That won't hold them forever," he grunted. Ethan took one last look at the burning remains of the refuge. Their home was gone. But they were still alive, and as long as they were alive, they had a chance. Tara grabbed his hand, her grip firm. "Where to now, Commander?" Ethan exhaled, looking toward the dark horizon beyond the tunnel exit. There were no safe places left, not really. But he knew one thing. They wouldn't stop fighting. "The city," he said. "We find supplies. We find weapons. And then, we find a way to end this." Behind them, the fire raged on. The dead would come again. But so would they. The tunnel smelled of mold, rust, and death. The survivors moved in near silence, their footsteps echoing off the damp concrete walls. Ethan led the way, his rifle raised, every nerve in his body on high alert. Behind him, Tara walked with her pistol drawn, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Harris kept close to the rear, his breathing heavy, sweat dripping from his face. They had escaped the refuge, but their fight wasn't over. Not even close. The horde was still behind them, far enough that they couldn't hear the moans, but close enough that Ethan knew they had to keep moving. The tunnel sloped upward, leading to a rusted service hatch. Ethan pushed against it. The metal groaned but finally gave way, letting in a rush of cold, stale air. One by one, the survivors climbed out. They were in the city now. It was a corpse of its former self, once a thriving metropolis, now an endless maze of abandoned cars, crumbling buildings, and bodies strewn across the streets. Some lay still, others twitched, half-rotted things waiting for their next meal. A faint moan carried on the wind. The dead were everywhere. "We need higher ground," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We find a building, secure it, and figure out our next move." Tara pointed to an old apartment complex about a block away. "That should work. It's tall, and if we barricade the stairs, we can control the entrance." Ethan nodded. "Let's move." They moved carefully, weaving through the wreckage of a lost world. Silence was survival, one wrong step, one careless noise, and they'd have the entire city crawling after them. Halfway to the building, a child cried out. Ethan's heart clenched. He turned to see Lena, one of the few surviving mothers, desperately covering her son's mouth. The boy, no older than 6, shook with fear, his wide eyes darting toward the shadows. Then came the first screech. Not a moan. Not the slow, aimless groaning of the typical dead. This was something else. Ethan's blood ran cold. "Runners! Go! Now!" he hissed. They sprinted for the apartment entrance as the first runner burst from a nearby alley, its skeletal form moving at an inhuman speed, its jaw snapping wildly. More followed, a pack of them, their razor-thin bodies covered in dried blood, their empty eyes locked onto the fresh prey. Harris fired first, dropping one, but there were too many. Ethan swung his rifle around and shot a runner mid-leap, its body twisting before it crashed to the ground. Tara took down 2 more, her aim steady, but it barely slowed them. The apartment doors were open. That was both good and bad. They had a way inside, but they had no idea what was waiting for them. Inside. Move! Ethan roared. The survivors rushed in, dragging the wounded behind them. Ethan and Tara slammed the doors shut just as the runners crashed against them, howling and clawing at the wood. Get to the stairs! Ethan ordered. The group raced upward, some barely able to keep up. The runners were already tearing through the doors below, their shrieks echoing through the halls. Floor after floor, they climbed. No stopping. No looking back. Finally, they reached the top floor, shoving old furniture into the stairwell behind them. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy them time. Ethan collapsed against a wall, his chest heaving. The city wasn't just overrun, it was a hunting ground. The dead here weren't wandering. They were waiting. Tara knelt beside him. That wasn't normal. Those things, what the hell were they? Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow. They're evolving. Silence filled the room as that realization settled in. No walls. No safe zones. No last refuge. Only the fight to survive. The wind howled through the shattered windows of the apartment rooftop, carrying the distant echoes of moaning and shrieking through the city ruins. Ethan knelt near the edge, scanning the streets below with his rifle. The dead were swarming, thousands of them, drawn by the gunfire and chaos of their escape. The runners were different. They weren't just moving aimlessly through the streets like the rest of the undead. They were searching. Their heads twitched unnaturally as if they could sense the survivors nearby. Ethan clenched his jaw. They weren't safe here. Nowhere was safe anymore. Tara stepped beside him, her expression grim. The barricade won't last, she said. They'll tear through it before sunrise. We need an exit, Ethan muttered, scanning the nearby buildings. If they stayed trapped here, it was only a matter of time before they were ripped apart or starved out. Harris, panting from exhaustion, wiped the sweat from his forehead. There's gotta be a way. A sewer system, maybe? A back alley? There's something, Ethan said, pointing to a suspension cable running from their building to the next. It was an old electrical wire, likely used by desperate survivors in the early days of the outbreak. If they could get across, they could keep moving. Tara followed his gaze. You want us to climb over a goddamn death trap? Unless you have a better idea, Ethan shot back. Tara sighed. I hate that I don't. Below them, the first crash of breaking wood rang through the stairwell. The barricade was failing. We go now, Ethan ordered. One at a time. No mistakes. The survivors gathered, their faces pale with fear. Lena clutched her son, trembling, but she didn't argue. She knew it was the only way. Harris volunteered first. He grabbed the rusted wire, wrapping his hands with cloth before sliding across. He landed hard on the next building but gave a thumbs up. It holds. One by one, the survivors followed. Lena and her son went next, then 2 more fighters. Each time, the wire groaned and swayed, but it held. Then came Tara's turn. She took a deep breath, grabbed the wire, and started moving hand over hand. Halfway across, the cable snapped. Ethan's stomach dropped. Tara plummeted toward the street below. At the last second, she twisted and crashed through a window on a lower floor of the opposite building. Shit! Ethan barked. She was alive, but barely. Then the moaning grew louder. The runners had reached the rooftop, their twisted, skeletal forms creeping through the shadows, eyes glowing with inhuman hunger. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slung his rifle over his back, grabbed the frayed remnants of the cable, and jumped. The wire snapped completely, but he managed to swing, colliding with the fire escape of the next building. The impact nearly knocked the breath out of him, but he held on, scrambling to climb up. Below, the dead swarmed into the apartment, drawn by the noise. They had minutes before the entire building was crawling with the infected. Ethan found Tara slumped against a wall, bleeding from a deep gash on her arm. "Can you walk?" he asked. She winced but nodded. "I've had worse." The rest of the survivors were on the rooftop, watching anxiously as Ethan and Tara climbed the last few steps. Harris exhaled. "Thought we lost you too." Ethan checked the horizon. The city stretched on, a maze of destruction and death. They had escaped the Horde, for now. But there was nowhere left to run. Tara tightened the bandage around her arm. "So, what's next, fearless leader?" Ethan stared at the distant skyline, where a single military outpost blinked weakly with a red light. "We go there," he said. "It's our only chance." Tara followed his gaze. "Or our last mistake." Ethan exhaled. One way or another, this was going to end soon. The survivors moved through the ruined city, sticking to the shadows as they made their way toward the military outpost in the distance. The red beacon atop the communications tower pulsed faintly against the night sky, a lonely signal in the sea of death. They had no way of knowing if the base was still operational, but it was their only hope. Ethan led the way, his rifle gripped tightly, scanning every alley and broken window for movement. Tara walked beside him, her wound hastily bandaged, her face set in grim determination. Behind them, Harris and the remaining survivors moved carefully, the fear in their eyes barely masked by their exhaustion. Lena clutched her son, whispering reassurances even as her hands trembled. The dead were everywhere, but the real threat wasn't the slow-moving hordes. It was the runners. The first attack came without warning. From the wreckage of an overturned bus, 3 of them lunged, their skeletal forms blurring with unnatural speed. Harris fired, dropping one. Ethan swung his rifle around, barely managing to fire a round into the chest of the second runner, sending it sprawling. But the third? It slammed into Ethan with the force of a freight train, sending him crashing onto the pavement. The runner's rotting fingers clawed at his throat, its blackened teeth snapping inches from his face. Tara fired. A clean shot to the head. The thing collapsed on top of Ethan, its foul stench burning his lungs. He shoved it aside, gasping for breath. "They're hunting us," Tara panted, reloading. Ethan pushed himself up, nodding. "And they won't stop." They ran. The military outpost was just ahead, a barbed wire fence, crumbling guard towers, and a massive steel gate, hanging slightly open. A fortress from the old world, long since abandoned. Or so they thought. A voice crackled through an unseen speaker. "You shouldn't have come here." The group froze. Ethan turned toward the gate, scanning the darkness. "Who is this?" Silence. Then. "The dead aren't the only monsters left." Before Ethan could respond, gunfire erupted. Not from inside the base. From above. The rooftop of a nearby building lit up with muzzle flashes, figures silhouetted against the night. Not soldiers. Raiders. They'd been waiting. "Ambush!" Tara shouted. Bullets tore through the air. One of the survivors cried out and fell, blood pooling beneath them. Harris dragged Lena and her son behind a wrecked truck as more gunfire rained down. "We need cover," Ethan shouted. Tara pointed to the base entrance. "Inside. Now." Ethan grabbed a grenade from one of the fallen fighters and hurled it toward the snipers. The explosion shook the ground, sending debris flying. It bought them a few seconds, just enough. They sprinted for the gate, shoving their way inside. The outpost was a graveyard. Corpses in military gear were scattered everywhere, their weapons rusted, their bodies torn apart. Bloodstains covered the cracked pavement. And then they heard it. A sound worse than the runners. A deep, guttural growl. Tara raised her rifle. "Tell me that was the wind." A shadow moved in the darkness. Then another. From the ruins of the outpost, they emerged, the true horrors of the apocalypse. Behemoths. Once human, now towering abominations of rotting flesh and muscle, their bodies fused with bones and twisted sinew, their eyes burning with feral hunger. The first one charged, its massive bulk shaking the ground as it barreled toward them. Ethan fired. Tara fired. Harris fired. Nothing stopped it. The survivors scattered as the behemoth swung a grotesque arm, smashing through a barricade like it was paper. Then the horde followed. The entire city was coming for them. Ethan grabbed his radio, desperate. Whoever's on this frequency, we need help. Now. Silence. Then, a voice. Get to the tower. Last evac in 5 minutes. Hope. Ethan turned to the others. We end this. Now. Tara smirked, raising her gun. Let's give 'em hell. And as the dead swarmed, as the last survivors of the refuge made their final stand, Ethan knew. This was it. Win or die. There was no turning back. The end.